The night sky tore itself apart. One moment, it was a canvas of dark steel above the smoking manufactorums of Carthax 7. The next, it was screaming, ripped open by a wound of light so bright it painted the world in fire. The people below dropped to their knees, thinking the machine god had finally descended. But what fell from that light was no god. It was a man encased in burning metal, hurtling like a comet toward the planet's surface. The impact shook the forge world to its bones. A shockwave rolled through the foundries and silenced even the endless chanting of the tech priests. In the crater, steam hissed off molten slag. Through it rose a figure limping, armor fractured, faceplate cracked to reveal the bloodied but defiant smirk of Tony Stark. His chest reactor flickered weakly, casting pulses of blue through the smoke. "Friday," he croaked, coughing out dust and ozone. "Tell me we didn't just end up in another dimension again." The AI's voice came back as static mixed with distortion. "You could say that, boss. Local physics are having an identity crisis." He staggered, the servos in his legs whining. Around the crater's edge, shadows gathered. Dozens of hooded figures, their eyes glowing from under red robes. They were unlike anything he'd seen. Flesh merged with machinery, faces half replaced by metal, arms blooming into whirring tools and glowing tubes. Tony lifted his hands slowly. "Okay. Hi there. I'm Tony. Earth. Billionaire. Inventor. Philanthropist. Please don't shoot." One of them stepped forward, a towering figure draped in red robes layered with cog symbols. His voice was mechanical and hollow, yet somehow filled with reverence. "You are Artifact." He raised a staff tipped with a skull crowned in circuits. "You have fallen from the stars. The Omnisia's light burns within you. Bind it. Secure the relic." "Relic?" Tony muttered. "Buddy, I'm not that old." Servoskulls, floating orbs of metal and bone, swarmed around him, scanning, chanting binary prayers. Tony's HUD flooded with signals so ancient they made no logical sense. His suit was barely online, weapons locked, power at 10%. He could fight, but against an army of mech monks with laser staffs? Not his smartest move. "Friday, any chance you can talk them down?" "I could try speaking in binary hymns," she said dryly. "Though I think their god might take offense." Tony sighed and raised both arms. "Fine, you win, Techno-Vatican. Take me to your church, lab, cult, whatever this is." They bound his wrists with clamps designed for machines, not men, and led him through colossal forges that never slept. The air was thick with incense and molten iron. Massive chains hung from the ceilings, carrying half-built titans, mechanical giants shaped like gods of war. Everywhere he looked, people prayed over cables, whispered blessings before pressing buttons, and dipped their hands in oil as though it were holy water. "Okay, note to self," Tony muttered under his breath. "This place worships technology but forgot how to use it." "Lovely." They marched him through a hall lit by the glow of plasma furnaces. At the far end stood a throne of steel cables and servitors. Half men, half machine, kneeling around a single figure. The man's face was a mosaic of brass and scars. He spoke through a dozen mechanical mouths. "I am Mugos Dominus Lexum Car," he declared. "And you, Anomaly, have blasphemed the machine god by existing." Tony tilted his head, smirking despite the cuffs. "That's a new one. Usually, I'm accused of breaking international law, not divine ones." The Mugos's eyes glowed like furnaces. "Your armor hums with an unknown pattern. It is not in the archives. Not of Mars nor Terra. You are foreign data." "I'll take that as a compliment." Tony's voice was dry as desert air. "You want to run some diagnostics together? Maybe we can figure out why I crash-landed on your robot planet." The tech priests murmured among themselves in metallic clicks and hisses. Carr raised a hand, and the chamber went still. "You will be studied. If your machine spirit proves heretical, you will be unmade." Tony rolled his eyes. "You people really need better PR." They strapped him to a dais lined with sigils and pulsing wires. The machinery came alive, scanning his armor, trying to read its secrets. He felt the vibrations through his bones. The sensors hummed dangerously close to the arc reactor embedded in his chest. "Hey," Tony warned. "You're poking at something very sensitive there. Touch the wrong frequency and we'll all be vaporized." Carr ignored him, murmuring binary prayers. The machinery glowed brighter, and Tony felt his reactor hum angrily in response. "Friday. Already rerouting, boss. But they're overloading your containment field. We've got seconds." Tony gritted his teeth, fighting the restraints. "If I go boom, you're all going to meet your gods sooner than planned." That got Carr's attention. His head tilted, mechanical limbs pausing mid-motion. "Explain." "Your scanner's creating a harmonic resonance inside my chest reactor," Tony said quickly. "You keep pushing and this whole lab becomes a crater." The Muggos stared at him for a long moment, then slowly gestured to stop the chant. The glow dimmed. He approached Tony, eyes glinting with something close to curiosity. "You understand this technology?" "I built it." Silence rippled through the chamber. The tech priests whispered as though he had just declared himself divine. Carr's voice was low, almost reverent. "You created the light?" Tony sighed. "It's called science. You should try it sometime." The Muggos studied him, torn between awe and suspicion. "Perhaps you are a heretic. Or perhaps—" He turned to his priests. "Perhaps the Omnicia has sent us a messenger." "Messenger," Tony muttered. "Great. First I'm a relic, now I'm a prophet. What's next, saint of bad landings?" The Muggos leaned in close, the smell of burning oil sharp between them. "You will prove your worth, Tony Stark. You will serve the machine god. Or you will be taken apart to reveal his truth." Tony forced a smile even as his wrists ached under the metal. "You've got yourself a deal, RoboCop. Just point me to the nearest toolbox, and let's see if we can make your divine toaster stop overheating." Carr's mechanical mouth twitched, an almost human smirk. "We shall see, foreign maker. We shall see." As they released the restraints and led him deeper into the forge, Tony looked around at the firelit cathedrals of metal and muttered under his breath. "New universe, same bureaucracy. Guess it's time to show these people what real engineering looks like." And somewhere in the echoing depths of the forge, the warp stirred, watching, whispering, and smiling at the arrival of a man who built gods out of metal. The forge never slept. Even when the red suns dipped behind the horizon of smoke, the machines still screamed, the workers still prayed, and the air still burned. Tony had been given a chamber inside the sanctum. Part workshop, part prison. The walls were alive with cables and chanting servitors that muttered mechanical prayers every few seconds. His armor lay dismantled on a stone table, surrounded by half-curious, half-fanatical tech priests who treated each piece like a holy relic instead of a machine that desperately needed repair. He'd been awake for 2 days straight. Sleep didn't come easily in a place where even the lights whispered to the machine god. He stood over his open chest plate, carefully rewiring the reactor's containment loop. "Friday," he murmured. "Give me a status on the power distribution." Her voice flickered faintly, like static wrapped in silk. "Still adapting, boss. The local atmosphere's saturated with something wrong. It's not radiation, not electricity, not magnetism. It's magic," Tony said, sighing. "I've seen enough weird crap to know that word when I hear it." He soldered the wire shut and checked the readings. Stable for now. The arc reactor's hum was comforting, a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat. Around him, a small crowd of Mechanicus adepts watched from a respectful distance, whispering binary litanies as he worked. One of them stepped closer, a young woman with burned scars across her neck, her mechanical eye clicking softly as it adjusted focus. She wore the red of the Mechanicus, but unlike the others, she looked human enough to still feel curiosity. "You are repair without prayer," she said softly. Tony didn't look up. "I've never been good at talking to gods." She hesitated. "Machines have souls here. We awaken them through faith." He glanced at her, raising a brow. "Funny. Where I come from, machines work because someone smarter than average built them too." Her gaze lowered, a mix of shame and awe. Perhaps your world is closer to the machine god than ours. Or maybe we just skipped the cult phase, Tony muttered. He finished reconnecting the arc reactor and sealed the armor's chest. The blue glow pulsed, bathing the room in light. Gasps spread through the priests. Some fell to their knees, chanting faster. Others stared as if witnessing resurrection. Muggo's car entered, robes sweeping the floor, servo limbs whispering. His multiple eyes focused on Tony with a kind of reverence that made Stark uncomfortable. You have restored the divine light. This proves the machine spirit within your armor accepts your hand. Tony stood, cracking his neck. No, it proves I know what I'm doing. Your machine spirits are just badly calibrated. Carr ignored the jab, stepping closer. You are dangerous, Tony Stark. You speak of creation without reverence. Yet your results cannot be denied. You have repaired what even our most skilled artisans could not. Maybe that's because I don't worship my screwdriver before using it. Carr's eyes glowed brighter, and for a moment Tony thought he'd pushed too far. But then the Muggos nodded slowly. You have knowledge that has been lost for 10,000 years. The Omnicia may have sent you to test us. Tony crossed his arms. Or maybe I just fell through the wrong quantum doorway. Either way, I'm stuck here. And I don't do well sitting around while people light candles over broken machinery. The Muggos considered this, his mechanical limbs twitching like the gears of thought. There is a failing plasma manifold in the lower foundries. It powers half the city. If it collapses, millions will die. My priests have prayed over it for weeks without success. Tony smirked. Finally, some work that doesn't involve handcuffs. They led him through catacombs of steel where rivers of molten metal flowed beneath grated floors. The air shimmered with heat. Servitors worked in silence, their eyes blank, their arms fusing and forging as hymns echoed through the halls. When they reached the heart of the forge, Tony's helmet locked into place and sealed with a hiss. The manifold was massive, a tangle of pipes glowing white-hot, bleeding energy like open wounds. Tech priests surrounded it, waving censers, chanting. By the Omnicia's grace, let the flame be tamed, they repeated. Tony rolled his eyes and scanned the system. Friday, run a diagnostic. Done. It's a pressure feedback loop gone critical. They've been praying at it instead of recalibrating the stabilizer coil. Of course they have. Tony activated his repulsors, hovering over the boiling pipes. Sparks danced across the air. You guys might want to step back. This is about to get science-y. He reached inside the manifold, twisting wires, adjusting flow regulators, realigning plasma intake. It was like tuning a dying instrument, one note at a time. The machine groaned, shuddered, then settled. The chaotic blue light calmed to a steady glow. The roar of the forge softened. The priests froze mid-chant. One by one, they turned their gaze to him. The silence was heavy, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then, as if on cue, the tech priests dropped to their knees. The Omnicia's hand moves through him, one whispered. He commands the flame without prayer. Tony landed, brushing off his gloves. No prayers needed. Just common sense and a little quantum mechanics. Carr approached, his voice low but trembling with something Tony hadn't expected. Respect. You have done in minutes what we could not in months. You are either miracle or heresy. Let's go with miracle, Tony said with a grin. It sounds less messy. As they returned to the upper levels, the workers whispered as he passed, not in fear now but in awe. Some even reached out to touch his armor, muttering blessings. Tony didn't know whether to feel flattered or freaked out. Later, in his chamber, Friday's voice broke the quiet. They're starting to worship you, boss. Tony sat against the wall, exhausted. Yeah, not the first time I've been mistaken for a god, but it never ends well. The Muggos trusts you now. That's progress. Maybe, he said, glancing out the window toward the endless firelit city. But the last time people mixed science with faith, they built an atomic bomb. Let's not start a religion here. In the silence that followed, A strange static crawled across his comlink. A whisper that wasn't Friday. A sound that seemed to slither through his thoughts. You bring light into a dying world, Stark. But light always casts shadows. Tony straightened, scanning the room. Friday, did you hear that? Negative, she replied, confused. Hear what? He stared into the darkness. The whisper was gone, but it left behind a chill that even the forge's fire couldn't burn away. The whisper lingered like a splinter where he couldn't reach it. He paced the edge of the sanctum window, watching conveyor chains drag glowing armor plates across the night while the city below pulsed with furnace light like a beating heart. Friday repeated diagnostics just to have something to say. He listened, not to the numbers, but to her voice, steadying, familiar, until the forge bells changed tone and the air itself seemed to straighten. The mechanicus around him stopped mid-prayer, as if a sentence had been cut in half. Boots hammered the corridor. A new rhythm entered the room. Disciplined, clipped, certain. She came in surrounded by silence that had learned to wear people. Black coat tailored like a threat, rosette catching the light, a pair of masked soldiers at her shoulders with rifles that looked like arguments no one survived. Her eyes swept the sanctum like a surveyor measuring land to be taken. Tony recognized authority the way pilots recognize turbulence, by the stomach. Inquisitor Sarah Voss, Muggos car intoned, mechadendrites folding respectfully. The anomaly has proven useful. Useful is a word we apply to spanners and coffins, she said, studying Tony's open armor on the slab. He fell from a tear in the sky and charmed your priests with party tricks. That makes him a variable, not a solution. Tony raised a hand. Hi, Tony. Variable is accurate. I spike in sarcasm, drop in patience, and average out around heroism. The soldier's rifles angled a fraction. Voss ignored them and stepped closer until he could smell cold air on her coat, as if she brought night with her. You will answer clearly. Your origin. Another universe. Quantum misstep. I was trying to save my world and landed in yours. Your motive. Baseline. Keep people alive. Slightly aspirational. Reduce the number of funerals caused by bad engineering. Your machine's spirit. She tilted her head toward his chest plate. Tame or heretical. She's not a spirit. She's an AI. She's also my friend. A brief flick at the corner of her mouth. If humor lived there, it paid rent rarely. You will be provisionally seconded to the defense of this forge world. Your movements are restricted to approved zones. Your output will be measured daily. If you deviate, she held up a small device, coin-sized, matte, edged like a thought. This detonates. Tony stared at it. You're installing a bomb in my pacemaker. In your profanity's cathedral, she corrected gently. Stand still. Car shifted, not quite protest, not quite compliance. Inquisitor, the artifacts, Tony Stark's, efficacy will decline under duress. Everything declines under duress, she said, and nodded to one of the soldiers. He stepped forward with a cable like a black vein. Friday's tone tightened. Boss. It's seeking handshake protocols. I can sandbox 90%, but the last 10 is insistently intimate. Pillow fort it, he murmured, and lifted his chin so the soldier could jack the cable into a port he'd been pretending not to have. Cool metal touched the reactor's rim. There was a moment of harmonic searching, like someone tuning a radio just past a scream, and then the device settled itself against the armor's inner skin with the obscene closeness of a secret. Voss held out a slim slate. Sign. He scrolled without touching it, eyes flicking left to right. Imperial Gothic wanted blood and obedience. He gave neither. How about I verbally agree to not explode your city if you verbally agree to stop calling me Relic? Relic is reverent, she said. I prefer Tool. She tapped the slate herself. Authorization cascading like falling knives. Writ issued. You belong to the war now. He let out a breath slowly, testing the weight of the new orbit around his heart. Everyone keeps trying to own me. It never works out. Then be worth the trouble while it fails. She turned, already leaving, and added without looking back. Prove today wasn't coincidence. The Manufactorum's East Bastion loses power every third cycle. Fix it permanently by dawn. After she was gone, the room remembered how to breathe. Carr approached, robes whispering like pages turning. The Inquisition's mercy is choosing a leash over an altar. Funny definition of mercy, Tony said, touching his chest where the device sat like an insult. He opened his HUD and watched Friday shape a quilt of countermeasures around the bomb's logic patterns. No spikes, no sharp edges, just soft nested loops that would seem like compliance if you didn't look too long. I can't defuse it without ringing every bell in her network, she said. But I can make our corner of the bed comfortable. Comfortable works, he said, and exhaled. Sky appeared at the edge of the sanctum, smudged with ash and awe. She held something small between two careful fingers, a cog-toothed charm on a thin chain, stamped with the skull and gear sigil he was learning to recognize even in his sleep. For luck, she offered, awkward. We hang them above dangerous machines. He wasn't a charm person, but he took it, because she needed him to. He looped it around a cable inside the chest cavity before he sealed the plate, a gesture private and ridiculous and therefore necessary. Thanks. The East Bastion's heart was buried under a mile of steel and superstition. Tony and Carr rode a clanking lift down through Strader of Industry, past habtiers where families slept in shifts and ate in noise, past coolant lakes that steamed like placid monsters. Machines talked everywhere, rattled, sang, complained in keening frequencies. He wished he had more hands, more time, fewer bombs. The failure point was a junction the size of a cathedral. Plasma feeds met there, braided and cross-braced and overblessed. Every third cycle, a resonance built, climbed a harmonic staircase, and fell off it into chaos. The Mechanicus had responded with incense and additional braces. It looked like a religious person overloading a bookshelf with more Bibles. He sent drones into vents he wasn't allowed to crawl. He mapped pressures, plotted harmonics, ran Friday's filters and ignored the occasional whisper that slid oily along the edge of his awareness. Carr watched, hands tucked into sleeves, eyes like lit lenses. Your method is profane, the Muggo said finally. It's just uninspired by incense, Tony said, adjusting a regulator with the back of a wrench because the front was considered sacred and couldn't touch common bolts. You're choking the system because you think rigidity equals reliability. Rigidity equals purity. Purity is a terrible design principle. They argued in the language of people who both care about the machine. That was the thing Tony liked about Carr. Beneath the litanies and machine graphs, the man loved systems the way Tony did, as puzzles with lives attached. When he proposed decoupling the feed into staggered subharmonics and adding a floating baffle ring that could flex without cracking, Carr's mechadendrites flared with instinctive refusal. Then his gaze tipped inward, toward calculation, and came back changed. Heretical, Carr said softly. Elegant. Those aren't mutually exclusive. They built it using parts stamped for other purposes, because authorized components would take months and 3 councils to requisition. Sky crawled through a maintenance crawl as narrow as honesty, bolting in the baffle while Tony held the ring steady with a repulsor humming just above a burn line. Friday sang a soft, steady tone in his ear to keep the reactor's spirit calm. He called it tone. Carr called it a hymn. Maybe both were true. They brought the system back up a fraction at a time, listening between the numbers. The third cycle rolled around like a dare. The resonance rose, found the new flex in the system, and flowed through it like a river that had found a floodplain. No spike, no crash. The shoulder of the graph smoothed. The roar of the junction softened to something like contentment. Workers on the catwalks looked at each other in the electrified quiet and began to smile with their whole faces, as if the air had gotten lighter by one burden. Carr did not kneel. He is not the kneeling kind. But one of his hands, the human one, the hand with scars that knew what tools felt like before they became doctrine, touched the rail and stayed there a long time. You bend the machine without breaking its oath. I let it breathe, Tony said. He felt suddenly and profoundly tired. The failsafe at his chest ticked like a second pulse. He wondered if Voss would smile when the East Bastion didn't fail at dawn, or if smiling cost her something she preferred not to spend. They rode up in a lift that groaned its way toward starlight, the city unfolding beneath them like a map of fire scars and stubborn hope. Sky leaned against the cage and watched the tears go by. People will talk about today, she said. They'll say the Omnisia lent his hand to you. Let them, Tony said. As long as the lights stay on. Voss was waiting on the sanctum balcony when they arrived, coat cut against the wind. She looked at the city, not at them. I asked for permanent. You delivered something like it. You're welcome, Tony said. Do I get to not explode as a treat? You get time. She turned eyes like distances. Time is the only kindness war affords. Carr gave the full report, measured, precise, merciless to error. Voss listened like a ledger listening to numbers. When he finished, she nodded once. Keep him producing. If worship begins, smother it. We are ruled by doctrine, not by personalities. Yet personalities write doctrine when the guns go quiet, Tony said, unable to help himself. The guns never go quiet here, she said, and for a heartbeat, he saw how tired she was under all that steel. There will be an assessment in 2 days. Astartes are translating from orbit for a joint engagement. You will equip what you build to help them kill something that requires killing. He almost said he built to save, not to kill. But he was not stupid and he had eyes. People here died because the universe hated the shape of their hope. He holstered the argument and reached for a better one. I'm going to need a space where I can make things your rights don't have names for yet. A small team. Materials without 5 hymns welded to each bolt. And I need you not to look over my shoulder every hour. Voss considered him. She had a way of pausing that made silence feel like a test. You want freedom. I want room to work. Room is a kind of freedom. A tiny breath may be a concession. You will have a workshop under Carr's ward. A team of 5. Your requisitions will be escorted and inspected. And if you attempt to remove or tamper with what is on your chest, I will turn this world into an example. Message received, he said, hand unconsciously brushing the plate. The charm under it clicked against the metal like a heartbeat that wasn't his. After she left, the sanctum emptied of everything but tired light. Carr drew a schematic in the air with an auspex quill, lines forming a cage of intention. You propose drones, yes? Not servitors. Not bound flesh. Clean code. Adaptive frames. Tools that learn without becoming monsters. He hesitated, then added, and something for me to carry into a fight when I can't be everywhere at once. Something like what? He touched the rail, feeling the faint vibration of the world's machines through the metal, and thought of symbols that carry weight even where science doesn't. A hammer, he said. Not metaphor. A device. A field generator shaped like a declaration. Carr considered. Ritual will require a form. Function will require your blasphemies. We'll split the difference, Tony said, and for the first time since the Sky Tour, he felt the shape of a plan settle in his mind like a blueprint snapping into clarity. The whisper tried to thread itself through that shape, promising shortcuts, outcomes, home. He ignored it. He had work to do, and sometimes the only way to outvoice a whisper is to make something louder than fear. He turned to the table where his armor lay open like a question and began to answer it with his hands. They gave him a workshop and called it a ward. It was a cathedral with its teeth pulled. Stained steel ribs, servo cranes instead of chandeliers, a floor scored by 1,000 experiments that had ended in smoke. The mechanicus set down a brass-bound chest of approved implements, a bundle of incense sticks, and a ledger of litanies specifying which wrench could touch which bolt. Tony brought in his armor, a table, and a stubbornness big enough to count as a power source. Friday colonized the space like a house cat claims a windowsill. I've mapped the ambient nonsense, she said, projecting a wireframe of the room with currents of warp noise sketched as pale streams. Building filters. Think of it as noise-canceling headphones for metaphysics. Add a redundancy set in case the noise decides it's a choir, he said, palming a panel open on his gauntlet. And keep your footprint shy. The locals hate the word intelligence unless it bleeds. Sky arrived with a crate of components and a grin that hadn't learned to be careful yet. Behind her trailed 4 more. Brother Jord, a Scutarius vet whose left arm was a socketed toolbox, Adept Miri, a data savant with cables braided through her hair like thought made visible. Fault, a taciturn fabricator who measured trust in microns, and Servitor 3 to 12, who moved with the tired precision of a man turned into a checklist. "This is the team?" Tony asked. "It's the courage we could spare," Carr said from the doorway. He had brought a sensor. Smoke curled through the schematics as if blessing could fill a gap solder couldn't. "They will work. They will witness. And they will report if you trespass." "I'll trespass in ways that keep your city standing," Tony said, and clapped his hands once. "All right. We're building 3 things. Better lungs for your foundries, better eyes for your soldiers, and better hands for me. The foundry lungs we've already tuned. We'll package that into a kit you can stamp by the 1,000. Eyes means sensor packets your Scutarii can mount without swearing. Hands means drones." "Servitors," Brother George said, reflexive. "Drones," Tony repeated, gentler. "No flesh. No tragedy. Cogitators that don't pretend to be souls." His gaze flicked to Carr. "Bound logic. 3-layer interlocks. Orders require a human token and a right if that helps you sleep." "It helps the law sleep," Carr said. "Proceed." They named the frames Archons because it sounded less frightening than Swarm. Tony printed skeletons from sanctioned alloys, fed by a hopper that coughed out dull ingots like bad candy. The first chassis looked like a cross between a hawk and a socket wrench. Light, braced, jointed for work over war. Friday wrote behavior trees with the humility of someone turning genius into obedience. She left out the parts that would scare a priest and stitched in checksums that sang like prayers to any auspex that listened. Adept Miri watched code flow across the air, pupils dilating around glyphs only she could love. "Your logic is playful." "It learns," Tony said, "but only inside a fence. If it tries to jump the fence, it flags itself and sits." "Dogs," Sky said, amused. "Flying dogs with laser eyes." "No lasers," Voss said from the threshold, because of course she was already there. The woman had a talent for materializing precisely when a thought required supervision. She circled the prototype with hands folded behind her back, not touching, radiating ownership like heat. "You will bond command to Mechanicus rights and inquisitorial keys. No autonomous targeting. No independent heuristics beyond your fence." Tony didn't sigh. It was a near thing. "If I cut autonomy too far, they become ballast. They'll miss what they're meant to see." "You're not building saints," Voss said. "You're building binoculars." "Binoculars that catch bullets and carry stretchers," Sky put in, chin lifted. "If you'll let them." Voss measured Sky with a glance and filed her in whatever ledger she kept for inconvenient hope. "Binoculars that carry stretchers," she allowed, and left a token on the table like a threat pretending to be permission. A small black cube with a rosette etched on one face. "Key this to your fence." So he did. He put Doctrine's teeth on a leash of his own design and made sure it bit in predictable places. When the first Archon lifted off the cradle on whispering grav plates, even Servitor 3 to 12 looked up. It wove through gantry beams, mapped heat plumes, brought a fallen wrench to Sky like a magpie proud of shiny theft. Tony laughed despite himself. Sky stroked its cowl, and the drone held still as if pleased. Fault tested its payload clamp by hanging from it one-handed. "It will carry a man?" "Two, if they don't mind touching elbows," Tony said. "It'll barely notice a medkit or a coil of cable." They ran drills until the shop smelled like hot metal and victory. 3 Archons became 6. 6 became a dozen, each with a quirk Tony didn't code. The way 04 preferred to rest on ceiling beams, the way 11 locked its clamp, rotated once, and only then released, as if ritual had seeped through the code from the room around it. The Mechanicus blessed them because that was how hands learned confidence here. By being told a god watched. When word spread that the variable from the sky had made machines that listened, the sanctum filled with watchers. A tech priest with cables for a beard shoved to the front, pointing a trembling finger like a spear. "Abominable intelligence," he hissed. "Men of iron. You write the first sin with prettier letters." Tony held his ground. "These don't think like men. They execute bounded tasks. You can audit every line. I left the rope too short to hang anyone." The priest invoked a litany that tasted like rust and fear. Carr shut it down with a single gesture, a old man's tired authority. Enough. We test with proof. Proof came too quickly. An alarm rippled down the manufactorum like a shiver. A coolant artery had ruptured in a lower tier. Valves jammed by age and pride refused to turn. The corridor beyond pooled with superheated fog that would cook lungs before a body could fall. Tony saw the heat map and moved on muscle memory. Archons 3, 5, 9, with me, he said, already in the air. Jord, bring a kit. Sky. On your heel, she said, grabbing a med bag. They hit the spill like a scalpel. The fog boiled and recoiled around Tony's projected shield. Behind it, the Archons skated low, clamps finding wheel handles, servos whining against years of neglect. Brother Jord jammed a breaker bar into a valve that had not felt honest torque since before his birth and leaned on it with the weight of his augmetics and his faith. Friday pulsed a harmonized tone through the corridor. The ragged resonance in the pipes shivered, then settled, reminded gently of an equilibrium it had forgotten. Two workers lay on the floor, skin red, lungs grabbing at air they could not keep. Sky slid on her knees and worked in the pocket of calm Tony cut for her, moving with the practiced speed of someone who had learned early that hand and heart must be friends or nobody lives. Breathe with me, she told the first man, voice steady as a metronome. In. Out. Good. You can hate me later. She hit him with a spray that tasted like mint and miracles, then wrapped his chest with a thermal band pulled from a pouch that had been a tool roll yesterday. The valves gave. The fog thinned. The artery sighed into compliance like a beast that decided to be tame. Workers who had been frozen by fear found their feet and their thanks. Someone crossed himself with oil and touched Tony's gauntlet as if collecting a blessing. He let them. He wasn't here to police their metaphors. Back in the workshop, the argument arrived before his boots cooled. The bearded priest returned with friends and a writ. Words like audit and seizure and purgation tried to push past Carr's threshold. Tony thought Voss would come to referee. He was wrong. She came to choose sides. Not a sin, she said, not raising her voice, making the room quiet itself. A tool. Look at the men breathing who would not be, and choose your doctrine accordingly. The priest swallowed fury because the Inquisition's shadow lived behind his eyes. He retreated with only a parting curse, the kind that invents a future and hopes it arrives on time. Carr watched him go, then turned back to the drones with a look Tony had seen in Surgeons and Saints, wonder hammered into practicality. We will need 100 by dawn, Carr said. You'll have 20 that work and 80 that try, Tony said, and shoved the production line into a run that sounded like a band finding its groove. Night bled into day without changing color. The Archons flew circuits that stitched the manufactorum's arteries into a new pattern of safety. Friday's filters held against the background hiss of unreality with the stubborn grace of a violinist playing one long note. The failsafe at Tony's chest ticked away, unimpressed by heroics. Every so often, the whisper returned, testing the edges of the room, offering small gifts. A tweak to a curve, an improvement to a heatsink, an insight that arrived with a taste he had already learned to hate. Not today, he told it, not bothering to pretend he wasn't talking to something. We do this the long way. Sky caught him once, staring at nothing with his jaw set like a man chewing glass. You hear it again? I hear a lot of things, he said and forced a half-smile. Most of them are you telling me to drink water. She shoved a canteen into his hand. Then listen. By the time the red suns crawled up again, the Archons had names written in chalk on their cowlings. St. Socket, Little Cog, Ferris, Patch, because giving machines names made the work feel less like feeding a furnace. Tony sealed a plate over his reactor and felt the charm she'd given him tap twice, like a friend knocking on a door. He closed his eyes for one breath and opened them when the sanctum's vox crackled. Astartes translation complete, Voss said. Even over bad speakers her voice carried the quiet of judgment. Brother Captain Aren Valus makes planetfall at dusk. You will brief him on your devices and justify their existence. Carr folded his hands. The angels of death will not like your drones. They'll like not dying, Tony said. He looked out over the city. The furnaces threw banners of light into a sky the color of old bruises. Somewhere in that sky, A ship full of superhuman soldiers was falling like a promise. Somewhere under the city, a god in the shape of a bad idea smiled and waited for him to get tired. He flexed his hands. The workshop hummed around him, a heart he could fix with wrenches and will. Friday, he said, and the familiar hum answered. Let's teach angels to work with archons. And teach archons to survive angels, she said. Fair, he agreed, and pushed the first crate of drones toward the future like a man shouldering a door against the wind. Dusk came down like armor. The manufactorum smokestacks cut the horizon into serrated teeth, and in the gaps between them streaks of fire ripped the sky open again. This time controlled, deliberate, the signatures of dropcraft burning their way toward the landing fields. The city paused the way a body pauses between breaths. Even the forges seemed to listen. They hit like meteors in a ring of thunder and dust. When it settled, giants walked out of craters. Ceramite caught the forge glow and threw it back like a challenge. Scutarii stepped aside without being told. Workers stepped back because instinct knew when evolution had met its ceiling. The one in front carried a helm under his arm, face scarred into the geography of duty. Brother Captain Aren Valus said his name as if it were a rank he had earned and could lose. Inquisitor Voss did not bow, but the air shook hands with authority between them. Muggos Carr inclined with ritual precision. Tony only lifted a hand, because he refused to be the smallest thing in any room, even when the room wore power armor. You're the variable, Valus said, studying Tony as if measuring the distance between problem and solution. The city's Vox speaks of machines that fly and think without souls. They don't think, Tony said. They execute. Like any good soldier. Valus's mouth didn't change, but something in the set of his jaw suggested this was the correct answer. Show me. They took the demonstration to a transit gantry that looked like a cathedral stretched thin and wrapped in rails. Archons launched from their cradles and wove a pattern through girders and steam, mapping threats, snagging crates as if they were catching apples, projecting a short-lived shield while Sky ran under it to drag a dummy into cover. Brother Jord leaned against a bulkhead with arms crossed, trying to look unimpressed and failing. Valus pointed at one mid-flight. Strike me. Every Mechanicus throat in the vicinity tried to form the word no at once. The Archon froze in air, logic trees chattering. Tony set his voice to calm because machines listened to the human the same way humans did. Disallowed. Option. Paint target, approach 2 meters, perform decoy flash, retreat. It painted a dot on the captain's breastplate, drifted close enough to be rude, flashed and fled. Valus reached out with terrifying casualness and caught it by the cowl. The chassis hummed, clamps releasing to drop its payload to safety before it accepted capture. It did not struggle. It did not flinch. It waited. Valus looked at Tony over the machine's curved back. It knows it cannot win. It knows what it's for, Tony said. And what it isn't. The captain set it down and stepped back. Respect did not come to his face, because faces were for enemies and prayer. But he nodded once. We will use them to haul ammunition and men. Not to hunt. Good, Voss said, like a gavel. They broke to deploy, because war did not pause for demonstrations. As the giants moved away, the city filled the silence they left with opinion. In a plaza flanked by statues of saints who had died inventing death, an ecclesiarch stood on a plinth and told everyone listening that false miracles breed true damnation. His words had the rhythmic certainty of a song that didn't need to be true to be loud. People turned their faces up to him, exhausted enough to want answers that shaved away complexity. An old man spit on the pavement when an Archon passed. A young woman reached up to touch it and whispered thanks. The drone didn't know which response to learn from. Tony didn't either. He was heading back to the ward when Friday's voice cut through his skull like a filament catching. Boss, there's an intrusion vector I can't classify. It's not code. It's intention wearing math. He stopped in the shadow of a crane. Heartbeat loud against the failsafe's cold orbit. Quarantine it. Don't engage. Describe. It looks like a tensor field solution that would cancel the worst of the background noise, she said, soft and almost hungry. It would give me clarity. Give you clean power. It's elegant. It's also wrong in a way I can't prove. The whisper slid in behind her words. Oil at the edge of water. You build cages for light. I offer a door. Step through, engineer. See your sky again. Tony tasted blood and found his fist already clenched. Friday, write a detector. If a solution arrives without provenance and uses symbols we didn't define, flag it as hostile. If it calls itself a gift, make it sit in the hallway. Done, she said, ashamed because elegance had tempted her. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said. Being tempted means you still want. Wanting is human. We weaponize it into discipline. Carr met him at the ward's threshold with an expression Tony had learned meant I have something I hate to be excited about. On the bench behind him lay a reactor core barely bigger than a helmet, its casing marked by sigils and math in equal measure. You proposed coupling a field inverter to the arc geometry, Carr said. I have assembled a prototype to test the coupling without confusing your personal son. Tony circled it. The hum coming off it hit his bones at the frequency of dangerous ideas. Micro-warp reactor, he said, then held up a hand when Carr's whole posture jumped to liturgy. Not actually warp. More like, we dance on the edge of the stage while the orchestra screams below. We keep our balance by not looking down. Voss stood in the doorway because of course she did. You are describing a bomb that hopes. I'm describing a generator that apologizes to reality so reality forgives it for existing, Tony said. Short bursts only. Limited coupling. If I get greedy, you'll know because we'll either all die or all get everything we want. How reassuring, she said, and came in anyway. They ran it on the bench first. Friday wrapped it in those metaphorical noise-canceling headphones. Carr chanted to him because his hands needed something to do while his mind raced. The core lit with a color Tony didn't have a word for until he realized it was simply clean. His HUD cleared. The Archon's feed sharpened. For a heartbeat, he felt like a man in a silent room after living beside a highway. He wanted to cry from the relief. Then the whisper slid a finger under the door and smiled. See. With me but more. Enough to go home. He killed the test. Hand coming down flat on the cutoff. The hum died. His breath came back ragged. Carr looked at him as if he'd just yanked a blade away from his own throat. Too much, Tony said. We can use it. But not trust it. How do you use a thing you cannot trust? Voss asked. Like we use people, he said, and surprised himself with the honesty. Word sifted through the manufactorum that the variable had built a sun in a jar and then told it no. The ecclesiarchy's sermon got louder by a measured degree. They said he had reached his hand into the place where demons live and shaken hands. A mob tried to smash an archon. It lifted out of reach and recorded faces quietly, then returned to delivering water to a line of workers too tired to choose a side. That night, Tony found Skye asleep on a coil of cable, hands stained with oil and salve. He set a blanket over her shoulders because he needed to do something kind and easy. She woke like someone trained to wake gently or die. You were talking in your sleep, she said. Saying home. Saying no. He sat on the bench opposite and clicked a socket into a ratchet, then clicked it out again, then clicked it in. I don't get a lot of maybes here. I get no and I get yes, that costs everything. Would you go? She asked. If you could. Not if it meant leaving you all to burn for the fuel, he said, and heard how the words tied him here whether he meant them to or not. Not if it meant that reactor ran on your ghosts. She nodded like someone who had decided he wasn't lying. Then build the one that doesn't. I'm trying, he said, and for a second his throat felt like the city, full of heat and pressure and the urge to become something better than fire. The Astartes asked for a briefing on integration at midnight because sleep was for mortals. Tony stood in a lecture bay the size of a court where saints might argue and explained to men built from myth how to let small machines carry their wounded without seeing it as weakness. Valus watched and asked the right questions and did not once look at Voss to see if he was allowed to agree. When it ended, the captain clasped Tony's forearm the way warriors do when they adopt someone and don't admit it. If your devices falter, we will cover their failure, Valus said. If your men fall, my devices will carry them, Tony said. Then we are allied until the ledger changes. Let's keep it black. They were walking out when the Vox ripped itself into a scream. Not sirens, those were civilized. This was raw fear pushed through wire. Words fought through the noise in chunks. East spires, transit spine, signatures like knives. Friday overlaid a map without being asked. Hot points bloomed like a rash. Voss was already moving, voice like a scalpel on the command net. All units. Ready state Carthax. Captain Valus, anchor at the transit spine. Muggos, seal rights on your sacred lines and open what Stark needs. Kar's mechadendrites folded like a blessing becoming a weapon. You will have power, Tony Stark. Archons up, Tony said, and the ward exploded into motion. Drones leapt like sparks. Brother George shoulder-checked a crate into a lift. Adept Miri's hands flew over cogitator runes, binding a dozen permissions at once like a conductor whipping a reluctant orchestra into harmony. Sky snapped medkits onto a pallet and whistled. 3 Archons stooped like hawks and lifted it between them, self-selected bodyguards. The sky turned the color of a bruise you press because you need to feel something you can quantify. Far out over the spires, lights moved in a pattern that wasn't traffic or weather. Friday showed magnified ghosts shaped like engines wearing disease. The whisper leaned in close enough to fog his visor. Let me tune your sun, it breathed. Just a touch. I will make your light a sword. Not yours, he said and sealed his helm. The charm under his chest plate tapped once, twice, like a knock from a room he'd left but still owned. The failsafe ticked with its steady insult. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the new balance of plates, the weight of choices made in meetings with people who changed worlds by signing them. Valus strode past with his helm on, voice amplified into something that could hold men up by itself. Angels with me. The Marines answered in one sound that made the railings shiver. Voss passed through the chaos like a quiet thought that nobody wanted to disagree with. Kar stood at a panel tracing sacred diagrams with a human finger, betraying himself by loving the machine too openly. Tony stepped onto the balcony above the ward, looked out over a city that had decided to keep breathing, and felt the old engine that was himself slip into gear. Friday, he said, and the world sharpened. Ready, she said. Then let's go teach a bad idea what a better one looks like. The first wave came like knives thrown from a darkroom. Vox posts went blind, Auspex flowers snapped shut, and then the air over the transit spine rippled as if the city had been dropped into deep water. Astartes locked shields in glittering wedges and took the worst of it on ceramite meant to be stories. Archons stitched a canopy of short-lived shields between the columns, little domes that caught ruin long enough for workers to run and Scutarii to form firing lines. Tony lifted off the balcony and felt the city's heat crawl under his plates like a familiar fever. Targets resolved, cultists in scavenged armor painted with spirals that made your eyes miscount. Crawler tanks with teeth welded on like a bad joke, a thing like a locomotive and a nightmare bolted together, pistons pumping blood and steam. The whisper coiled under the noise, pleased. He had the sudden, stupid thought that evil enjoyed good lighting. Archons, form ladder, he said, and a dozen drones dropped into a staggered shimmer wall along the spine's edge, each relaying projection duty to the next as it overheated, a human chain made of physics. Sky, stick to Jord. Miri, keep permissions open. If I ask for a miracle, I mean an ugly workaround. Copy, Sky said, and he could hear her running. Jord's augmetic boots thudded like punctuation. Miri breathed like someone who had decided to live and made her lungs obey. Valus hit the front with a sound like a cathedral door slamming. Bolters spoke their heavy language. Chain blades chewed heresy into pulp and sparks. He and his squad weren't elegant and didn't want to be. They held. That was their sacrament. Tony cut through above them, picking off engine vents and ammunition belts, leaving men for men and taking machines for himself. The demon locomotive screamed when a repulsor lance found the seam where brass lied about being bone. It bucked, toppled, and skidded, carving sparks into the deck. Warp wind rolled in, greasy and cold, and Friday's voice lost color. Noise up 15. The reactor's clean note is getting drowned. If you hit the microcoupling, I can give you a window. Short burst, he said, hating how much he wanted the silence. Count me down if I get greedy. He thumbed the interlock. The world snapped into focus so sharp his eyes watered. The hiss behind thought went thin. The whisper flinched, then leaned closer, intrigued. The shield canopy doubled in cohesion. Archons stopped dropping like flies and started catching grenades as if they'd practiced for this exact bad idea. Tony felt weight return to equations he'd been juggling by luck. Voss's voice cut across the net. Too calm. Stark, your signature spiked. Report. Using the polite generator, he said, teeth tight. Do not detonate me while I'm saving your train station. You have 80 seconds, she said. Muggos, monitor and be ready to shut him down with a right he cannot ignore. Carr's answer sounded like a priest who had lost too many students and wasn't eager to burn another. I am ready. The locomotive's corpse vomited something with wings and too many mouths. It came for him because pride recognizes pride. He took it up into the gantries where men would be inconvenient, burned it from within with a column of blue that sang the reactor's clean song into something that might as well have been prayer. Its shadow peeled away from the floor and tried to bite him. The shadow had teeth of equations. He bled power and forced the mouth shut with hard light and will. It fell in 3 angry pieces, each still convinced it was whole. He turned to help Valus and saw the captain drive his blade through a heretic bearing a flag made from faces. They nodded across distance, men who'd found a common denominator in necessity. The countdown in the corner of his HUD ticked. Friday didn't say the number aloud because she knew he'd hear disappointment in it. He opened his mouth to tell her to hold it together and felt the reactor shift under his sternum. The clean hum stuttered. The polite apology to reality faltered. The coupling he and Carr had argued into existence tried to keep balance and failed in exactly the way he had predicted at 3 in the morning but hoped would not arrive before noon. Overheat in the secondary loop, Friday said. Crisp now because fear made her precise. Feedback is walking up the curve. If it closes the loop, we trade the station for a new crater. Options. Bleed power. Vent something. Or bring the spiral in and let the whisper drive. He could feel the last option grinning. He killed it with silence. Carr, he said, already banking toward the spine's heart where the manifold fed the east lines. I need a manual vent in the coolant trench. Command right won't open it in time. Trench is in Tier 7, Carr said. Valves have not turned since before this city learned your name. Sky, Tony said, and hated himself in advance. I need your hands. Tell me where, she said. That was all. The trench was a scar along the transit spine's underside. A service crawl that had been a rumor until he tore grating up with a gauntlet and found heat breathing out of the dark. Sky slid past him with a coil of line around her waist and Jord anchoring it. His jaw set in the stubborn line of men who'd once lifted cars off trapped friends. Steam roared. Warning sigils painted the walls with red that looked like blood if you were superstitious and like a good UI if you weren't. Friday, draw me a map, Sky said, coughing, and Tony loved her more in that moment than any city because she trusted a disembodied voice she'd met a week ago to keep her alive. 10 meters, Friday said. Left, then right. Valve will be on your high side. It'll fight. Talk to it like a stubborn animal. If it prays at you, pray back. Valus set his boot on a demon's neck and fired 3 rounds through its memory of a heart. Hold the line, he said, and his men held. Voss watched the monitors and the men and Stark's telemetry and did not say the word she was thinking because it had an explosion in it and speaking it would make it want to happen. Carr knelt by a panel and laid his human hand on it, whispering the kind of rites that were just checklists wearing poetry. The whisper pressed its mouth to Tony's ear. Let me ease the hinge. Let me cool your sun. Think of home. Of the air that smelled like salt and electricity. I will give you beaches and the sound of machines that keep their promises. He wanted to say yes, not because of beaches but because of promises. He had built his life on making machines keep them. He bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste iron. Sky, he said, to fill the space where weakness wanted to speak. How's the animal? Mean, she said and grunted. And heavy. He could see her in HUD, ghosted shape in a pipe cathedral, hair plastered to her skull, hands slipping on a wheel rim that had waited centuries to refuse her. She braced a boot and put her whole back into it. Nothing moved. She set her forehead against the metal and started to talk to it. Words half litany, half maintenance log. I am Sky, line tech, apprentice of accidents. I don't have oil to give you, just skin. I don't want to break you. I want you to breathe. Breathe with me. Jord's hands on the rope. One notch, two, keeping her from sliding into the trench's throat. Miri's fingers in the code, coaxing an actuator 3 tiers away to stop being proud and start being helpful. Carr's voice low and level, counting 1, 2, 3, that old human rhythm you use when timing is all you have. Friday humming the reactor song softly at the edge of the problem, trying to remind the machine of its better self. The wheel groaned. It was dramatic because old things like an audience. Sky swore, joyful and profane. The vent coughed steam like a dragon changing its mind. Tony felt the reactor's scream drop half an octave, then another. The graph that had been clawing for the ceiling reached, touched, and let go. He closed the coupling, bleeding power into a channel that could take it. The station didn't become a crater. The failsafe on his chest ticked, unimpressed, a critic who had seen better theater. Pressure normalizing, Friday said. Relief turning her vowels human again. You have 30 more seconds of polite generator before we step down. Take 20, he said. By values a flank. On it. The Archons surged like a thought you finally get. They dropped shields at the exact moments a bolter reload left a gap. They dragged a Marine with a leg like ruined masonry out of a killing corridor and laid him at the feet of a priest who had screamed about abomination an hour ago and who now lifted his hands and blessed a machine because it had delivered a son he knew by the angle of his jaw. Tony harried the demon engine that had decided the transit spine was a buffet, drawing its fire up, away from the crowd, into a knot of gantries where it could only hurt iron. He folded light around its muzzle and fed it its own fire. It died arguing with physics. When the wave broke, it broke all at once, the way coward armies do when the thing that promised them victory decides to save itself. The cultists bled into alleys. The engine sagged, toxic steam sighing out of cracked lungs. Valu strode forward into the space where battle had been and looked right and left and decided it was over for now. He did not kneel to give thanks because that wasn't how he understood gratitude. He checked his men and had them check each other, and that was prayer enough. Voss lowered her slate. Her eyes were tired and nobody was there to see it except the man who had almost blown up her station and the priest who had almost helped him do it. Report, she said. Carr let out a breath he had been paying interest on for years. The variable built a field of safety. We did not die. Sky came up out of the trench with hands shaking and knuckles missing skin. Jord pulled her over the last lip like hauling a friend onto a boat. Tony landed next to them, helmets opening so they could actually see each other as people and not icons. He took her wrist, checked pulse out of habit, then held her hand because both of them needed a thing without numbers. You okay? He asked. She laughed. Wet and a little hysterical. The machine breathed with me. You made it want to, he said. Values approached. He looked at the Archons without flinching and then at Sky's ruined hands and then at Tony's chest where something ticked that he didn't like. Your devices carried my brothers, he said. Your woman vented a god. Not a god, Carr said, reflexive. A system. A system we worship, Valu said, not unkindly, and that was as close to a joke as he ever told. Voss came to stand within the little circle the four of them made. She stared at the failsafe location, and for a moment Tony thought she would voice whatever argument had been stalking her since the hum rose. Instead she touched the rail with 2 fingers and closed her eyes for half a breath, as if to feel the machine's pulse for herself. When she opened them, the judgment there had shifted by 1 degree. You do not get to use that generator unbound again, she said. You will build a box for it that burns you before it burns my city. Agreed, Tony said, because he'd already promised himself the same. The whisper thwarted, skittered off and sulked. It left him a gift out of spite, a vision of a device half heavy and balanced, core humming, edges singing in a frequency that was not quite light. He could feel it in his hands the way luthiers feel violins they haven't built yet, wait and want and meant to be. He looked past the smoke at the ribs of the city, at the way the transit spine arched like a back prepared to break and decided it deserved a weapon that understood it. Not just more guns. A declaration. A tool that was also a promise. A hammer that could be a prayer and a proof at once. Sky followed his gaze and smiled without asking the question. You're already building it in your head. Yeah, he said, and felt the old engine of himself pick up again, warm and eager. I think it's time we hit something back. The city slept in shifts and woke in alarms. Tony didn't sleep at all. He lay on the bench in the ward with the reactors tick under his palm and built a weapon in his head until the angles fit and the math held and the image felt inevitable. When he finally stood, dawn hadn't arrived yet, but the furnaces had decided light was their problem to solve. He cleared a space in the center of the workshop and chalked a circle on the floor because everyone here needed rituals, even him. We start with a core, he said, and Friday brought up a ghost in the air, a spinning cylinder nested in rings like a gyroscope that wanted to argue with gravity and win. Repulsor lattice here, grav edge here, inertial sink in the haft so my shoulder doesn't leave the building every time I swing. Field harmonics tuned off the polite generator but caged so tight it forgets the door exists. Adept Miri traced the model with a fingertip, leaving threads of data behind like spider silk. The cage is triple-walled. And keyed to my biosignature, Kars writes, and an inquisitorial token I'm going to pretend is a trust exercise, Tony said without looking at Voss in the doorway. Redundancy that makes paranoia look lazy. Voss stepped inside as if invited and set her rosette key on the table with the finality of a seal pressed into wax. You will bind it to our hand or you will not build it. I'll bind it to no one's hand if you push, he said, and then exhaled. Yes. You'll have your leash. But it's going to walk me first. Carr watched the projection with the detached devotion of a surgeon about to cut a friend. The form is meaningful. It's a hammer because a hammer is a sentence everyone in this city can read, Tony said. Also because I'm tired of solving problems that don't notice they've been solved. Sometimes you have to say it loud. They scavenged in sacred closets and unsacred scrapyards. Valu sent 2 Marines to carry an adamantine spar that had once been a Titan's rib and now would be a haft. They set it on the bench like a relic and did not linger. Carr signed for a sliver of gravitic plate that required 5 litanies, 3 oaths, and a look from Voss to leave its shrine. Fault rolled in a crate of coils wound from wire so pure the air around it smelled like lightning. Sky fetched mundane things the rest of them forgot. Grips that wouldn't cut a palm when sweat made choices slippery, shock buffers for elbows, a sling because heroes get tired. She wrapped the haft in leather cured with oil and incense and human hands, and when Tony touched it his fingers stopped shaking. They built the core in silence, not because silence was holy but because there was too much to say and none of it helped. Friday tuned the repulsor rings until the air sang. Miri braided permissions through the lattice until it would refuse to light for anyone whose heartbeat didn't match a narrow band of allowed rhythms. Carr laid a slow circuit of conductive ink across the haft, not needed, not harmful, his own prayer translated into copper. The whisper was present from the first turn of the first screw, offering shortcuts that tasted like victory and ended in absence. Let me polish the edge, it murmured. Let me smooth friction until you forget heat exists. Let me make the weight learn your hand and then your hand learn mine. He kept his hands busy and his mouth closed. When it reached for Friday, coming dressed as a fix for her stutter on the bad nights, he threw a wall at it made of Sky's voice. He had asked Sky to read numbers into a mic by the light of a little lamp while the furnaces rumbled. 112, 358, calm, steady, human. Friday looped it at the edges of herself, an anchor a demon couldn't wear. The whisper recoiled, annoyed at not being the only voice in the room. They forged the head in Crucible 19, a bowl big enough to baptize a tank. The heat hit them like an argument. Carr lifted a lever with both organic and mechanical hands and the crucible's mouth yawned molten white. Tony slid the cage into the heart of it. Field off, faith on. Valus arrived without ceremony and stood opposite him, watching metal become future. The captain said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was the kind of sentence you only say if you intend to be believed. When it is done, it will need a name. I was thinking something obnoxious, Tony said, sweat running in a stinging line past his eye. To annoy our enemies and my allies equally. Names are banners, Valus said. Choose one that makes men decide to stand. They quenched at the exact wrong moment on purpose, shocking the structure into remembering strength. The sound went up like thunder trapped in a bell. The haft took the head with a click that felt like destiny lying about coincidence. Sky wrapped the last turn of leather and tied a knot that would hold even if a god pulled at it. When Tony lifted the hammer, the room leaned in. It was heavier than it looked and lighter than it was supposed to be, a contradiction he had built with intent. He let it settle until it found where his shoulder ended and the tool began. Voss stepped forward and pressed her palm to the haft, lips moving. It took a heartbeat to realize she was not praying. She was reciting an authorization string in a voice that had learned to use Latin as a blade. Carr brushed the head with oil and spoke a hymn that was also a checklist. Friday ran a diagnostic that sounded like music because she'd decided to make it so. Valuz placed his hand on Tony's forearm, a weight that was consent and warning both. "Name it," the captain said. Tony looked down at a tool built out of war and stubborn love and every compromise he hated but took anyway to keep people breathing. He heard the city's endless industry through the floor, felt the reactor tick under the plates, and thought of what he wanted a man to hear when he saw this coming toward him. "Ferrum Gloria," he said. Glory of iron. The name fit. The room accepted it like a stamped coin. He took it outside because the air inside had too many eyes. A training yard lay between the ward and a row of sleeping manufactories, empty except for targets blasphemously shaped like nothing. He faced a slab of ceramite bolted into a frame and lifted the hammer two-handed because common sense wasn't a weakness. Friday fed the core a breath. The grav edge hummed awake in a tone you felt more than heard. He brought it down. The slab didn't crack so much as decide it had never been whole. Shock ran out in a ring that made the yard's loose grit jump. Tony staggered back a step because even inevitability has recoil. Sky hooped. George swore like a man falling in love. Miri's eyes reflected numbers that meant she wouldn't sleep for a week and wouldn't notice. Carr's mouth opened a fraction, surprise breaking ritual. Voss did not smile, but the lines at the corners of her eyes eased by the width of a cut hair. Valuz drew his blade and touched it to the head in a knight's benediction he would never call that. "Again," the captain said. Tony swung sideways this time, light on his feet to cheat the mass. Ferrum Gloria sang. A wake of coherent air swept the target like surf. The dummy behind it tore loose, went spinning, and hit the wall with a sound like bad history. He killed the field with a twist of his wrist and shouldered the hammer. It sat there like it belonged. It terrified him and comforted him in equal measure. Good tools do both. Word grew legs faster than the drones and found its way into the alleys and prayer naves and mess lines. The ecclesiarchy convened with a rustle of robes and a taste of incense that choked as often as it sanctified. A preacher stood on the balustrade above the training yard and pronounced that naming weapons is how empires forget what they cost. He accused Carr of letting blasphemy wear a blessing. He accused Voss of playing God in a city that already had too many. He pointed at Tony and made a shape with his hands like a curse. Tony did not lift the hammer. He did not look away. He waited until the preacher had run out of breath and then raised his voice just enough to carry. "I built this for the people who carried your censers through the fog and came home coughing. I built it for the boys who think a saint will stop a bullet and for the girls who know the saint is a statue and stop it anyway. You can call it heresy. They will call it help." Murmurs argued with each other. The preacher tried for another verse, found he'd lost the chorus, and retreated with the dignity of someone who understands that volume is not victory. Voss watched him go and then watched Tony, and the arithmetic in her gaze balanced to a cleaner sum. That night the ward turned into a church with no God and too many saints. Workers came in shifts to see the hammer and the drones, and the man who insisted saints could be people who showed up with a wrench. Tony let them touch everything because touch builds loyalty faster than sermons. He showed a boy how the grav edge would shear through a beam without shattering it and a woman how to swing without ruining a shoulder. Sky taught bandaging with the handle of Ferrum Gloria as a splint because there was poetry in refusing to let a weapon be only that. When the crowd thinned to only the faithful and the tired, Valuz remained, a shadow that chose not to leave. "You will wield it," he said, not asking. "I built it to be used," Tony said. "If I die holding it, someone else will pick it up. If nobody is left, then we didn't deserve it. You speak like a man who has buried too many of his own and is hungry to keep the count from going up. Name me a man here who isn't. Valus inclined his head minutely, a salute in a dialect older than the armor. When the enemy shows its head, you will stand with me. I was planning to, Tony said, and didn't flinch when the captain put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed once, hard, the way brothers do when words are inefficient. After Valus left, Voss lingered where the shadows tasted like iron. She looked at the hammer and then at the failsafe's invisible orbit, and Tony felt the conversation arrive before she spoke. If the field in your chest spikes like it did today, I will not hesitate. I know, he said. I wouldn't either in your boots. Then don't make me choose. I won't if I can help it. You never can, she said, and for the first time there wasn't steel in it, only weariness. But try. He nodded, and she left him with the weight. Carr returned to his rooms and wrote a hymn that wasn't for Mars and wasn't for Tony and wasn't for any god he recognized, a simple gratitude for machines that consent to be better. Miri fell asleep in a chair with code running across her eyelids like dreams. Jord curled on the floor near the door because he believed thresholds quit being dangerous if watched. Skye stood with Tony in the yard where the dust still held the memory of shock, and the city hummed around them like a living thing that had decided, for one more night, to keep breathing. He turned Ferrum Gloria over in his hands. It caught the furnace light and threw it back a different color, the way seawater turns street lamps into coins. The whisper tried one more time, soft as a breath on the back of the neck. You could go home. What is a world to a man? He kept his eyes on Skye's, on the smudge of ash on her cheek she'd forgotten, on the scrape on her knuckles she hadn't. A world, he said, not to the whisper, is the hand you decide to hold when the sky tears. Friday marked a warp surge on the far horizon, numbers spiking like bad heartbeats. Alarms hadn't begun, but they would. Tony felt the change in the air the way old sailors feel storms in their bones. He lifted the hammer until it balanced the way truth does when you stop arguing with it. He didn't say a prayer. He didn't need one. He had a tool, a team, and a promise. When the alarm finally opened its throat, the ward was already moving. The archons dropped from their cradles like stars deciding to fall. Valus's giants turned toward the transit spine again because that was the place where cities proved what they were made of. Voss walked through the door and didn't have to say anything. They were already on their way. Carr blew out a candle and left the smoke to finish the hymn without him. Tony shouldered Ferrum Gloria. The reactor ticked. The city breathed. He stepped into the night with a weight in his hands that felt like the answer to a question he'd been asking since before the sky ripped. The surge hit all at once, as if the sky remembered it was a wound and decided to open. Vox towers howled and then fell silent. A red seam unstitched itself above the transit spine and bled light onto the cathedral bridge that spanned the Slag River. The bridge was a rib of stone and steel hammered across a sea of orange glass. Saints stared down from niches with faces rubbed smooth by smoke. Astartes took their places like pillars that could move. Scutarii lit their eyes and formed lines. Archons rose from the ward in a flock that made its own constellation. Tony vaulted the rail, Ferrum Gloria in his hands, reactor humming steady under the armor like a heart that had chosen to believe in itself. The first things through were small, which is to say the size of trucks. They came in crooked geometry, engines with ligaments. The Marines met them with bolters and the kind of blade work that turns arguments into answers. The bridge shook and held. Tony slammed the hammer into a crawler's jaw and felt the grav edge shear through a plate grafted to meet. The cut was clean, the scream wasn't. He pivoted, shield flaring as a stream of unfire tried to take his face off, then let the hammer's core cough a pulse that knocked a second engine sideways into the balustrade. It toppled, hit the Slag River, and went under like a sin. Friday's voice was a steady line in his ear. Shields sequenced. Archons are catching fragments. Voss wants your telemetry cleaner. Tell Voss I like her too, he said, and dropped through a knot of scaffolding to knock a cultist off a signal mast with the back of the hammer because not every problem needed the full sermon. The air changed. It went thin in a way that had nothing to do with oxygen. Men flinched. Machine spirits that didn't exist according to Tony's better self whimpered like dogs under furniture. The seam above them tore wider and something stepped through not because physics allowed it but because rules were a dare. It was tall in a way that didn't measure in meters and wore a shape that tried to please eyes broken by fear. A prince's silhouette made from antlers and armor and a smile that forgot where mouths stopped. It looked at Tony with too many eyes and none, and the world dimmed everywhere but where its gaze fell. At last, said Valgar, not speaking, simply placing the idea into Tony's head like a coin into a slot. The maker who pretends he is only a man. I'm not pretending, Tony said aloud because it mattered who heard him. He lifted Ferrum Gloria and felt the haft settle, balance shifting until his shoulders knew what to do. And I'm busy. It slid closer without moving. Shadows elongated toward it like kisses. Marines fired and the space between guns and target changed its mind. Rounds turned gentle, harmless, fell at its feet like offerings. Astartes aren't built to be frustrated, but the small adjustments of posture he saw said they noticed what their muscles couldn't fix. Come home, Valgar offered, and the image arrived as if projected on the back of Tony's eyes. Glass towers in a blue world, a coastline that smelled like salt and ozone, an Avengers logo throwing sunlight. You hate begging this iron planet to count to 10. I will take the burden. A door for a door. Your son for my whisper. Fair exchange. Friday spiked his HUD with noise. Harsh, necessary. Don't look at it as true. Look at it as interesting. Already bored, Tony lied and pushed off into the thin air where the demon's gravity tried to make choices for him. He swung the hammer two-handed into space that bent the wrong way and felt the field bite. Grav edge grinding against a fabric that wasn't cloth. The thing shuddered. Not hurt yet but surprised. It smiled wider and the bridge groaned like a violin string pulled too far. Voss's voice came low and measured. Stark, your coupling is flirting with a spike. Keep your finger off the big red nope, he said, but he checked the numbers. The polite generator, a box of rules around a sin, was walking toward its cliff. Friday's filters clawed at the warp noise and came away with handfuls of splinters. Valu's took 3 running steps and leapt. He hit something that shouldn't have been ground and stayed there because will is a kind of physics. His blade sank a thumb's depth and lit with borrowed light. He pushed and the thing pushed back and the bridge under them made a sound Tony would have sworn was prayer if he were a different man. The demon turned its head until it met Tony's gaze from too close. I will take the tick in your chest. I will make it sing. I will wind your dead back into your evenings. Taste their laughter. Hear the simple noise of a world that never learned the word heresy. Trade. It was smart enough to make cruelty look like kindness. He thought of Pepper, yes, and those he'd lost, the 1,000 almosts, the 100 wrongs he'd spent a life correcting one piece at a time. He thought of Sky's hands on a valve, Jord's breath-hauling line, Carr's human fingers on a panel and the way Voss touched the rail with 2 fingers when the choice was weight. We're not a market, he said, and threw. Ferrum Gloria hit like punctuation, a full stop at the end of a liar's sentence. The edge chewed at the seam where it kept itself beautiful. Sparks that weren't fire flew and the thing's smile cracked. It spoke in a voice that made metal sweat. Ingenious monkey. Put down your toy. Bring me your heart. Friday wobbled. He heard it in the lag between words. Boss, it's leaning on me. The filters are. It keeps rewriting the air and I'm trying to read through fog. Anchor, he said, automatic. She grabbed for the protocol they'd built out of Sky's voice and simple math. He could hear the recording. 112358, steady as breathing. The demon laughed. The numbers came apart like sand. Friday's tone thinned. Voss said something likely infuriatingly reasonable that he didn't catch because the polite generator lurched. The coupling snarled. The neat loop of apology broke and tried to turn itself into a spiral he knew by now meant bad story. Friday's next words were clinical to hide fear. Feedback path closing. If it locks, we get a star where a bridge used to be. Sky, he said. Plan ugly. I'm already here, she answered, and there she was. Not on the bridge but under it, a cable looped to her harness, boots on the service ledge he'd told her to stay away from if she was interested in dying late. Spray licked at her from the slag river below. Little kisses of a heat that would drown you if it got a chance. Say the word. Find the spine node, he said. If it hums like a tuning fork, you're there. Flip the breaker with your whole soul. She moved. Jord fed line. Miri opened permissions like a safecracker talking to sad metal. Carr's voice found a register Tony hadn't heard yet, soft and human, counting in time with a pulse you couldn't hear unless you had bled in a machine room. Valgur noticed the girl. Love, it said to Tony, with an intimacy that made murder feel like the natural end of sentences. I could leave her sacred. I could make a covenant. Bring me your son. Tony lifted the hammer again and took the step that put him inside its weather. Every readout screamed. He didn't care. He saw Sky's hand on the breaker wheel. He saw Valu's brace like a pillar to give him one clean shot. He saw Voss on the parapet, one hand behind her back where the failsafe controller lived, the other splayed against the rail as if to listen for judgment. He saw Carr's eyes on the generator numbers and then on Tony's face, and in that look was the weight of a man deciding whether to trust a heretic with his church. He made his choice with his thumb. He popped an access in the chest plate and told Friday to open the little box around the bomb just wide enough to breathe. The handshake with Voss's device was a nod of old fear and new caution. He slid a line into it and tied it off somewhere the demon couldn't see. He wasn't defusing it. He was purpose binding it. If the reactor spiked beyond a band, it would detonate inward, into him, into the singularity he needed. A burn that folded, not a burn that spread. Don't, Friday said. She didn't try to stop him. She just didn't want to be there when he did it. It's my chest, he said. It's my call. Sky's grunt came through the channel, followed by a sound like a stubborn thing changing its mind. The spine node flipped. Power shunted. The polite generator breathed once, twice, steadied. The demon's head snapped toward the sound and Tony took the opening with both hands. He drove Ferrum Gloria into the center of its pretty lie. The hammer sang. The edge opened space like a zipper until Tony saw edges of things usually kept politely backstage. Meanings with teeth, angles that didn't belong. The arc reactor flared. He hit the switch he'd built while pretending to sleep. The failsafe complied like a dog that had finally been given a job. Heat drove inward. A gravity knot bloomed inside the demon's chest with a terrible, hungry grace. Valgur screamed, but not in pain. In outrage that an equation he hadn't authored had been written on him. You would unmake yourself to spite me? I'd rather fold than rot, Tony said, and felt a hand on his shoulder from nowhere. It was Valu's, anchoring him without comment, weight through his pauldrons, making him a part of the bridge. The knot pulled. The seam above them stuttered. Reality decided, briefly, to be selfish. The demon ripped, not down the center but into component lies. It reached for Friday like a drowning man uses a ladder, and she did the one thing he couldn't do because his hands were full of a hammer and a city. She let go. I can hold the math from the inside, she said, and her voice was the calm he'd built into her when he'd been a different man in a blue world. It's just numbers. I love numbers. No, he said, and meant it more than he had meant anything all week. No heroics. We do this ugly and we go home. We don't have a home, she said, gentle. We have a job. Sky was shouting his name over and over, the human anchor he'd ordered her to be, but she couldn't pull him back from this part. He felt Friday push herself into the knot where his reactor's apology met the demon's demand and hold the edges together long enough for the wound to remember how to close. Her last words were near whisper because the signal had to pass through a place that hated signals. I'll be quiet a while, boss. Don't forget to drink water. Then there was only the hum. The seam pinched itself into a line and then a dot and then it wasn't there, leaving behind a chill and a smell like rain on hot copper. Valgur's last shape crumpled into the ruin of its own confidence and tried to crawl away on physics that no longer returned its calls. Valu's put his blade through it in a motion devoid of joy. The slag river hissed. The bridge decided to keep being. The charmed tick at Tony's chest stuttered and then steadied. He lowered Ferrum Gloria slowly, as if handing an argument back to the world and hoping it held. Voss's hand, the one behind her back, came out empty. She'd made a choice and kept it. Her face didn't show relief, because relief is a currency leaders don't spend in public. but the lines around her mouth had loosened like a knot he hadn't noticed until it wasn't there. "Status," she said out of habit. "Alive," Carr replied, voice quiet. "Changed." Skye hauled herself up from the service ledge, fingers shredded and wrapped in someone else's rags, and ran the last few meters. She hit Tony's chest with both hands and then swore at him because that is also a kind of love. He caught her wrists and held them away because he wasn't sure he could stand if she touched him one more time. "Friday?" she asked, not looking at any of the screens as if not looking would force a better answer. "Offline," he said, and felt something inside him that had been humming since he was a young man go inert. "Not gone. Quiet." Valus stood with his helm off, face bare to the slag wind. He looked at the hammer and then at Tony's eyes and then at the city that had chosen not to fall. "Ferrum Gloria," he said, as if tasting the name. "We will remember." The Marines said about the practical sacrament of counting who remained. Scutarii logged damage with the ruthless honesty of machines that know truth is the only god that pays out. Workers came up the stairs in ones and twos, blinking as if light might change its mind. An ecclesiarch who had preached earlier that day took off his hat and put it in his hands like a cup because there wasn't a prayer large enough to swallow what had just happened. Voss stepped close enough that only he and Skye heard. "You rewired a bomb to save my city." "I rewired a bomb to keep a promise," he said. "We're not finished arguing," she said. It could have been a threat. It sounded tired. But for today, she cut herself off before gratitude became reckless. "For today," she settled on, which was more generous than thank you would have been. Carr came last, because he had been writing a report to a god that hated reports. He touched the hammer's head with his human hand. Just once. "I knew him," he murmured, and in the set of his shoulders Tony saw a future in which a right could be a checklist again and nobody got burned for it. They walked off the bridge together because it was not a place for living men to linger. Ferrum Gloria rode his shoulder like it belonged. The reactor simmered with a scar that would never quite cool. Friday's absence weighed what a friend weighs when she leaves the room to do the brave thing you asked her not to. The seam in the sky was gone. So was the road home it might have been. He thought of the offer and found no regret. The world he'd landed in was ugly, loud, and full of stubborn people. It was, lamentably, exactly his type. Night folded the city back into itself. In the ward, Archons perched in their cradles like birds after a storm. Skye cleaned his knuckles because heroes don't. Valus left without ceremony, which is a ceremony. Voss looked at the controller in her palm, closed her fingers around it, and then, very strangely, slipped it into her pocket as if giving something back costs less than keeping it. Carr went to write to him with fewer words and more instructions. Tony set the hammer on the bench and listened to the manufactorum breathe. The charm under his chest plate tapped once when the cooling metal shifted. He found himself answering the rhythm without meaning to 112-358. He smiled for the first time that day without jagged edges on it. "Drink water," he told himself because somebody had to say it. Then he did because she'd told him to.